Good morning. This is Jerry Green speaking from the Pacific Council, and I want to welcome all of you to our webinar today. We have a very special guest with us, Ambassador Michael Lawson, who is a member of the Board of Directors of the Pacific Council and the President and CEO of the Urban League. Just to give a slight bit of context to what we're doing today, Los Angeles is a very special place, and it's special in the sense it's really distinctive. It's probably the most global city in the world, and it's a major Pacific Rim city. It's a major Latin American city, and of course, it's a major city in California in the U.S. The Pacific Council has always argued that the traditional distinction between domestic issues and international issues is meaningless in a place like Los Angeles. So that if you are interested in homelessness, racism, nutrition, financial literacy, housing, any socially relevant, socially important issue, there is an international corollary to it. And so that we don't make a distinction between international and domestic. We think that they are very much the same. Ambassador Michael Lawson typifies this better than anybody I know on our board, and I mean this quite sincerely. Part of him is the ambassador part. He was the chair of the board of the Los Angeles Airport Commission for a number of years, and given his expertise in international aviation, President Obama appointed him to be the ambassador to ICAO in Montreal, which is the International Civil Aeronautics Authority. So that's, sort of traditional, very typical international activity. At the same time, Michael is the president and CEO of the Urban League, which is one of the leading organizations dealing with race relations and specifically the concerns of the Black community, and is really a uniquely important organization in our city. Long before the recent series of events that sort of brought people to the streets, for me and people far more expert for me, these are things that have been going on for hundreds of years, and this is simply the most recent denouement of a long trend in America. And perhaps we are at a tipping point. To think optimistically, perhaps this will be the moment of change that so many people deserve and so many people have been looking for. Ambassador Lawson is going to be interviewed by one of our members, Tanya Acker. Tanya Acker is a co-host of the twice Emmy-nominated Hot Bench, which is distributed by CBS. She's the host of the Tanya Acker podcast. And she's an experienced civil litigator who's represented a wide array of clients. She served as a temporary judge in the Los Angeles Superior Court and has a long history of social activism combined with remarkable professional accomplishment. Tanya will be asking a number of questions of Ambassador Lawson, and then she will open it up to questions from the floor, which you can begin to submit as soon as you wish. I really want to thank you for joining us today. This is a very important moment in our history, and one that I hope people take fully understand and take full advantage of. So with that, I will turn it over to Tanya and Michael Lawson.
Thank you, Jerry. Ambassador, one of the things that strikes me is that the outrage over George Floyd's killing really has taken on international aspect. Everyone is paying attention to this. As Jerry pointed out, international issues are not so easily separated from domestic ones. And certainly what we're seeing on the streets here at home, these protests, is a reaction to that. But it's not just a reaction to George Floyd, I don't think. How would you describe or define what a lot of people are discussing as the systemic racism that has culminated in the outrage that we're seeing today on the street? We hear that term tossed around a lot. What does it mean to you?
Systemic racism, thank you very much for having me, by the way. And thank you putting this together. Systemic racism is racism that is buried into the very fabric of the organization, very fabric of the city, the state, the nation. When you look at it, the New York Times had a very wonderful series of articles earlier this year called last year. It's called the 1619 Project, that chronicled what has been happening since 1619, which was the beginning of the first enslaved people were brought to the U.S. in that year. And there were so many articles that talked about the vestiges of that still remain today. And we see them sometimes in small pockets, sometimes you see them all happening at once. That's one of the things that happened here. It wasn't just George Floyd being murdered on the street. It was this coming behind, excuse me, other incidences that were very publicized. And people said, what is going on? The Ahmaud Arbery murder, when he was just jogging down the street. I'm forgetting her name, but the woman who was shot in her own home.
Breonna Taylor.
Breonna Taylor, yes, thank you very much. And not to mention the incident in Central Park where a bird watcher asked a woman to leash her dog, and she starts calling the police saying, I'm being attacked by an African American. And all these things kind of happen back to back to back. This isn't new. This is something that people of color have been dealing with for decades. This is a part of the conversation that I, as a father with two sons, we have what we call the conversation when they get to the point where they're old enough to drive. And we teach them how to engage with the police, not because we think so highly of the police, we want them to come home alive. And we know that without this, there's a risk, there's a very significant risk that they won't. So for those of us in the African American community and other communities of color, this is not new. But it was, I think we hit kind of a perfect storm of people seeing so many things happen. And the brazenness with which this Minneapolis police officer killed George Floyd in broad daylight, in front of witnesses who were videotaping it. And he showed absolutely no concern, let alone remorse. He was not even concerned with the fact that it was being taped as he was doing it. If he does this in that environment, what is he doing in the dark? What is he doing when nobody's watching? And I think that concept resonated with people. People said, okay, I've been told that this goes on, but I'd never seen it like this. And that's why you have this coalition, this rainbow coalition of just protest, not just in Minneapolis, not just in Los Angeles, not just in Washington, D.C., but across the globe. People are saying, this is unacceptable. I want to give a great deal of credit to Pacific Council for something that they did earlier this year. They had a trip to Montgomery, Alabama, to visit the Museum of Peace and Justice. And there were some who said, we're an international organization, why are we doing a trip to someplace that's within the United States? Well, this is why. Because people around the globe look at this, and so much of it happened in Montgomery. A and that's not the only place, but to go to this Museum of Peace and Justice, which was dedicated to, people talk about it as the lynching museum, but when you look at when you go to the website and it describes what it is, it includes police brutality as well. It is the modern day version of the lynchings that took place earlier in the 20th century. And the world got to witness that modern day lynching.
I have also visited the museum, and it's powerful, and it points out the long history of lynching and discrimination and unfairness and institutionalized unfairness. And, you know, what is your reaction to the notion that, gosh, why did it take a video? I mean, we have been having this conversation in this country for years. I went to that museum with my mother, who grew up in Jim Crow, Mississippi. I remember when Trayvon Martin was killed not very many years ago. What's your reaction to the fact that, do you have to see somebody killed on TV in order to believe the stories that people have been saying for years?
Unfortunately, my reaction is, I was surprised. I expected the reaction other countless situations that have occurred over the years, over the decades, where the only people that were outraged were the people who were in our community. And that's the difference here. And I'm not outraged about it. I'm happy about it. I'm thrilled. The coalition of voices, of skin tones, of backgrounds. I mean, is not just black and white. It's Hispanic, it's Asian. It's a multi. It's just wonderful to see. I'm not bitter about the fact that they weren't there earlier. I'm happy that they're here now. And it's a function of the fact that we have been talking about this for so long. But in the absence of just evidence that you cannot refute, sometimes people don't believe it.
What is your, we're hearing sort of different calls for reaction from, or rather different types of reforms, calls for reform from the protesters, and they really run the gamut. On the one hand, and I'd say there's much less of this, there are a few people, I don't know that I've heard this from protesters, but I think there are a few people who would say that the ex-officer Derek Chauvin, who we saw with his knee on George Floyd's neck, was a bad apple, that the other four with him were a bad apple, and that part of what we need to do is to more rigorously enforce already existing provisions against brutality and enforcing civil rights. I guess that's one end of the argument. The other end is none of this is working. Defund the police, and we have to start from scratch. I know that none of this is going to give rise to a simple solution, and sometimes people expect solutions that will perfectly satisfy everyone. We certainly don't have the time, I think, to explore all of the aspects to a comprehensive reform during this webinar, but what's your thought about the best way of going forward from here? You know, we've generated a lot of energy. There's more interest and outrage and concern about this than frankly I've ever seen. I'm gratified by it too. What's the next step in your view? Or how do we even start to think about taking the next step?
Well, here in Los Angeles is not the first step. Following the Rodney King beating, the Los Angeles Police Department was under a consent decree with the Justice Department, and a lot of changes were made. We changed the way we appointed the police chief prior to Rodney King. The government of Los Angeles, the mayor of Los Angeles, did not have the authority to remove the chief of police. A lot of reforms were made. Diversification of the department was one of the primary items on the list, and we had a lot of progress with respect to that. There were changes in the way officers were trained. We started some community policing efforts, and 10 years ago, that consent decree expired, and we rolled back. We didn't keep our foot on the gas pedal. We are not back to where we were before the Rodney King beating, but we are not where we should be. We were able to hire a lot of African-American officers during that period of time. And so we were successful in integrating and diversifying, excuse me, the police department, which is a key element to changing the face of the police department, not only to the public, but within the organization. To go back to your first question about him being a bad apple, there are good cops and there are bad cops. But what happens is there's a culture that's created. And even the good cops get sucked into facilitating the actions of a bad cop, like the other 3 cops who did not do anything to stop this. It's a club culture that either you're a part of it or you're not. So even good thinking, good cops get sucked into a culture if the culture is wrong. So you have to look at all of those things.
How do you, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
But the using LAPD as an example, we made some progress. We've slipped back. And since the consent decree expired, we now have a situation where 50% of the African-American police officers in LAPD will retire within the next 4 years. And there's nobody in the pipeline. So that's what happens. We made some progress. If you don't stick with the progress and keep it moving, you end up in a situation where you're trying to catch up again. I just wanted to get that point in.
In terms of trying to play catch up, which is admittedly hard, how do you do that? So if in a city like Los Angeles, half of the African-American police officers are going to shortly retire, what's the next step? Because people in African-American communities are going to have to feel that they can trust police officers and police officers who do not look like them. Because based on what you just said, the demographics are moving in a direction where more cops are not going to look like them. How do you start to rebuild that trust in a climate like this one?
One step at a time, and that's trite, but it's true. The police officers who are still there are senior. The current chief of police, quite frankly, was very close with John Mack, who was a former president of the Los Angeles Urban League. He is very well-meaning and wants to do the right thing, but there are forces within the department and within the city that will limit his ability to do so. But we now have a police department that is under the control of the city government, and the coalition that you're seeing on the street also exists behind closed doors. So it's not just the Black community going to the mayor and the city council demanding change. What I am working with as president of the Los Angeles Urban League is a coalition that includes all people of color within Los Angeles and people whose organizations are not tied to this mission, but understand that this mission is important. And it includes unions. A lot of time when you talk about the policing in various jurisdictions, one of the issues that comes up is the union participation and how the unions try to block every single progressive act that you try to impose on the police department. And in most jurisdictions, the unions kind of stick together. What we are seeing here is that unions, not necessarily the police union, but unions within the city are banding together, banding on our side and saying, no, this is not good. So we have a larger coalition that is going to the governmental authorities. We met with the mayor, we met with the city council, and we are being heard. Actions are being taken. Excuse me, prior to this, just to use the Los Angeles Police Department as an example, the city's budget, which was put together earlier this year before all of this happened, had an additional $123 million going to LAPD, which would represent 54% of the city's budget. One of the demands that we made was that would not happen. One of the reasons that you see large budgets for police departments across the country is that we have ceded to the police things that should have been done by other agencies. We have ceded to the police dealing with the homeless situation. We've ceded to the police dealing with students in school, instead of social workers and other agencies dealing with issues that befall each and every community. Somebody calls the police and they're the first responders for every situation that they're not trained to do. And we need to reallocate those resources to the experts who are trained to deal with all of the issues that befall our communities because of a lack of health care, because of a lack of support, governmental support that would normally come, the lack of sufficient schooling in our communities, all of these other things that we now that have been criminalized because we have defunded the social work that was normal, that was done years before. So we're relooking at all of those things, and I was a part of that negotiation team, and I will tell you that I was surprised that our city leaders listened, they understood, and they are moving forward on a lot of the things that we were asking them to do. So the answer is both and. That we need to defund the police departments across the country, but not defunding them just to defund them, but take those assets, those resources, and use them to address the real issues that befall all of our underserved communities.
What do you say to those who might be concerned that moving assets, decreasing police budgets is going to make communities less safe?
You know what's very interesting about the protests that have been going on over the past week? In Los Angeles, South LA has been quiet. South LA, so think about this. Most of the LAPD officers have been focused on the areas where the protesters are. National Guard was there. So there was very little police activity in South LA. And you know what? No problems. No problems whatsoever. And I get this from, I had a conversation with the deputy chief whose responsibility is South LA, which is mainly Black and brown. What I'm saying is that the problems that people perceive are going on in the underserved communities in Los Angeles, there is a lot of that was because the relationship between the police and the community was one that was hostile. When I was growing up, if I was in a car after 11 o'clock and you drive through a certain neighborhood, I would get stopped every time. What we're seeing with the increase in the diversity of the police department is a relationship between the police department and the citizens that serve that requires less of, you don't need as much funding to deal with the issues that are there. What you need is funding for services that the community otherwise lacks. Physical education facilities, educational facilities themselves, the Friday Night Lights, things that were going on following the Rodney King issue, the steps that would affect positively the economic outcome of the organizations of the communities that we're talking about. People of color love their communities. People of color love their neighbors. People of color are trying to do the best they can with the resources that they have, with the understanding that where we're concentrating is quite often a function of redlining, and where you have a situation where there is a conscious decision to not provide the resources that are available to others throughout the city. Those issues are being looked at for almost the first time in several decades. And we have the ear of the elected officials. We have more coordination among the various communities that I have been working with over the past 3 weeks. And we all know that we're in this together. And I think that what we're seeing from across the nation is that we are better off together than we are separated. I cannot say enough about just the Rainbow Coalition that has come out to say this is not acceptable. But now the work begins, and I'm proud to be a part of that side of the equation. There's a lot of work to do. There'll be a lot of resources that have to be reallocated. But going back to a question that you asked before, yes, there are plenty of good police officers in LAPD, in the Sheriff's Department, in police departments around the country. We need to give them the license to lead. So far, they have not had that, and we have to move. We have to give them the cover that's necessary for them to do that.
So this is my last question for you, and then we'll take questions from our webinar guests. One of the things that strikes me that's really a common theme in a lot of these stories, Breonna Taylor in her home, Ahmaud Arbery jogging in his neighborhood, Christian Cooper looking at birds It's this notion of African American people not being able to just be, not having the same freedom to just be left alone. You know, that you see like other communities will pick up guns and take to the streets. If you tell them they got to wear a mask or they got to stay home for a few weeks. With us, it almost seems as if our very right to just exist in the world unmolested is constantly being subject to challenge. So what I would love to hear from you as an accomplished African-American man who could probably give some encouragement to young people who are feeling very unsafe and very insecure in their spaces. What do you say to them to reaffirm the notion that this is their country, this is their space, and there is a way for them to feel safe and secure in it? People did it before. What are your words of encouragement to young people right now who are just feeling that sense of anger and despair?
Oftentimes I go back to words that were used quite often in the Obama administration. President Obama used to say, "We are the ones that we've been waiting for. It's up to us to move the needle." And I would say that what I'm seeing in the young people that I'm engaging with is that they are ready for this task. They are ready for this job. They are not afraid to step up and do the work. Some of them need to understand their history more. You'll hear some voices say it's never been this bad. And you have to remind them, oh yes, it has. I'm reminded of the Greenwood race massacre in 1921, when a young Black male walked into an elevator, and the elevator operator was a young white woman. When the elevator door opened, she claimed that he had done something, and the entire district of Greenwood was demolished over a 2-day period. 300 people died because of that. And it turned out that the police arrested him, did their investigation, and let him go because they realized that he hadn't done anything. But yet 300 people were dead, and an entire community that is known as Black Wall Street was demolished. During 1921, there were attacks like that all over the South. I'm from Arkansas. They called the summer of 1921 the Red Summer because of the killings that went on during that time. It was done in part because the Supreme Court had, in a case, said that the federal Constitution protected citizens from governmental violence. It didn't protect them from violence of private citizens, which gave the KKK license to do all the things that it did. I say that to say that things were demonstrably worse 100 years ago. Things are not there yet. Things are not there at the present time. We had the blessing of having an African American as president of the United States for 8 full years, which is a sign of what is possible. Growing up in the South, growing up in Los Angeles, growing up in an environment where you see what happened to George Floyd, maybe not directly, but you hear the stories. You learn from your colleagues that this is the way you have to conduct yourself in order to avoid being killed by the police. Knowing all the stories and knowing everything and knowing you have to do things differently in order to survive. Knowing that you have to teach your sons and daughters the same thing. And I'm not, and I can't go through the litany of all the horrors that have happened. But you don't have to look back too far. You look back to the nonviolence movement and the training that came from people that are still with us. Reverend James Lawson was one of the people that trained our people on how to be nonviolent in an environment where your life was on the line because you were just there. We're not in those spaces anymore, but there's a lot more that needs to be done. It is my remembrance of those spaces that give me hope that we can continue to move this needle. Our fathers and our grandfathers and our great-grandfathers faced much worse than this, and they continue to move on. I think that if we don't do our part, we are not giving them the respect that they rightly deserve.
Thank you for that and for that encouragement. I'm going to go to the first question, which really picks up on, I think, how we keep moving the ball forward, because that's only going to happen if we have conversations with people who may see this differently. And one of the questioners points out that Robert O'Brien, the president's national security advisor and also a member of the Pacific Council, said that there are a few bad apples, but he doesn't think that there's systemic racism in police forces around the country. What would you say to convince him otherwise?
I would say talk to the police officers behind closed doors and ask them that question. I would say, take a look at what we have in California, which is a police officer's Bill of Rights, a statewide bill that says explicitly that if a police officer is accused of actions such as this, they cannot be fired, they cannot be questioned for 2 weeks. When they are questioned, you cannot use the tactics that police officers use against people that they arrest. You cannot have 2 people interviewing them. I would say look at what happens. I would say you have to. You're not going to change his mind just by talking to him. But you have to. He can't ignore the reality. The fact is, this man was brazen enough to kill George Floyd in broad daylight in front of cameras. And no one was prepared to stop him. No one tried to stop him. No other police officer tried to stop him. And why is that? Is that because all those other police officers are the bad apples that we're talking about? I submit to you that at least one of those police officers was probably one of the good apples that he claims is the majority of the police department in Minneapolis. If there are so many good apples in Minneapolis, how is it that this officer, with an 18-year history of this type of activity, how is it that they didn't get rid of him? In his organization, if he had in his office someone who did not toe the line the way he wanted it towed, he would get rid of them. The idea that that, oh, there's some bad apples, we will just let them slide. He wouldn't let that happen in his own office. And that's the way we have to, every police officer is an example of, or of what the rest of the department looks like. There are pockets of officers who there are gangs within some police departments. Literal gangs within some police departments. So no, I am not condemning every police officer in every police department. I am not condemning every police officer in LAPD. I have a very good relationship with Michael Moore, the head of LAPD. I have a very good relationship with a lot of the senior officers in LAPD who are doing everything they can to change the culture. But they need the help of legislatures and people around the country. The protesters that are out there are actually helping them. But the fact of the matter is, a lot of these departments have a history of a relationship with communities of color that is toxic. And it becomes a club, a boys' club, if you will. That if you're not willing to do this, you're not one of us. You don't get promoted, so on and so forth. My response is, if there were so few bad apples there, then the department would have gotten rid of them. I'm not saying that the entire departments are bad, but a significant number of them are on the wrong side. And it is those numbers that perpetuate this type of activity. I am not a police officer. I've never been a police officer. I've not been in that environment, but I know enough of them to know that, yes, there are good officers. There's no question about it. We need to empower them.
Another questioner asks whether or not you believe we need a separate system of justice for police officers because of the proximity between law enforcement, between police officers and the district attorneys who would be asked to prosecute them. Do you think that we can, or people can, rely on DAs with whom they, or rather rely on DAs who often have to work with these departments in order to move forward with other cases? Can we trust DAs to prosecute bad officers?
Yes, we can. But you can't trust each one. I mean, there is a relationship between the district attorneys and the police officers. But we have to move to a situation where we all have to hold ourselves accountable. What you're seeing in the police departments, what you're seeing in the DA's offices, it's the same thing that you see in every organization. This is the police version of the Me Too movement, right? Not every person in the entertainment industry was harassing women, but they didn't say anything. They didn't do anything. And I saw it in the law firm that I was in. People were doing things that I felt uncomfortable with, but as a young associate, I struggled with, do I go along with the crowd or do I say no? It's a very simple example, and I don't claim to equate what the story I'm about to say with the killing of George Floyd. But there was a period of time when every Monday was ethnic joke day. And somebody would come into my office and tell me an ethnic joke, and it happened twice, and I said, stop. I don't want to hear it. And you never tell a Black joke, but I'm sure you tell them when I'm not around. I don't want to hear it anymore. And you know what? It just stopped across the board because nobody had said, this is not acceptable. I would challenge the good cops to push back on the bad cops and say, this is not acceptable. Within the ranks, behind closed doors, say, stand up and say no. That's what has to happen. And I know enough police officers to believe that it can happen. Of the organizations that you mentioned, you didn't mention the unions. They are a big part of this equation. They are a huge part of this equation. Traditionally, police unions support their members regardless of what they've been accused of. The police unions have to step up and say, this is not acceptable. And that will change, that will accelerate the changes that we're talking about.
Another questioner wants to know how you rate Mayor Garcetti's.
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah.
The microphone cut out.
Sorry. One of the questioners wants to know how you rate the mayor's performance in response, in responding to the protests, both the peaceful aspect to the protests and some of the violence that we've seen as well.
I give the mayor credit for his willingness to speak with and engage the community organizations around the city. I think I wish he had done it sooner rather than later, but he did. And I appreciate that. I appreciate his willingness to appoint Michael Moore as the chief of police in the first place. He has been doing a very good job of engaging with our communities and making significant promotions that that resulted in the situation that I just described earlier. You are not seeing the type of activities that's going on in Los Angeles. It's not happening in South LA. Why? Because the relationship between the communities and the command staff in South LA is a good one. The Deputy Chief Regina Scott is an African-American female who is in charge of South Bureau. And she is blue to the core. She is. You are not going to mistake her for somebody that you can walk over. But people know her. There's a relationship there, and she met with the community and said, "This is how this is going to work." The National Guard is not in South LA. And South LA is peaceful. The protesters, at no point do we condone the looters and the violent protesters. This is not helping us by any means. But I do want to give credit to Black Lives Matter for organizing the protest, but to the extent that they couldn't control everything. And it's gotten out of hand. I think the mayor called in the National Guard a little too early. No, I won't question the timing. What I do question is that he called them before he alerted the community that this was going to be happening. But we have a good relationship. And if you listen to his speech Wednesday evening, a lot of what he talked about, a lot of the reforms that he very eloquently brought to the table were reforms that we have been talking to him and asking him to put in place over the last week. So I applaud him for taking these bold steps. There's no question about it. This is baby step one, because he can't implement all of this unilaterally. We need the support of a 15-member city council. We need the support of the County Board of Supervisors. We need the support of all the people on this call to understand why this is important and why these changes are critical. We were on the path to changes like this while we were under the consent decree following the Rodney King beating. We have fallen back. We need to step up, stand up, dust ourselves off, and continue to move forward. I think that the program, the outline of the things that he wants to do are extremely positive, beginning with taking some of the responsibilities that shouldn't even be under the police purview, under other agencies that will be better equipped and better funded in a way that they could address the issues within our communities without it being the heavy hand of a policeman who was not trained in that area.
So you've spoken about some of the impetus for change and moving change forward and moving the ball forward, but Elaine Harris has a question that really speaks to some of the obstacles that stand in the way of that. You talked about the police unions who have, I guess, what you suggested and what a lot of what we've seen is a real reflexive defense of any conduct by any officer by a lot of the police unions. In order to change that, you were talking about a culture change, really a sea change in perspective and approach. Do you think that there is the political will and the sort of long-term commitment to that sort of really, to that sort of broad type of change? Is there the will and the commitment to engage in that in the long term?
Absolutely. When you look at the progress that we've made over the last 100 years, you absolutely. I have trouble answering the question because if I didn't think that, I wouldn't be able to get up out of bed in the morning.
Let me frame it a little differently. How do you get the police unions on board, for instance? Because you mentioned the union as an obstacle to holding a lot of police officers accountable. How do you get them on board?
If I knew the answer right now, we would have done it already. But the fact of the matter is, you begin with the conversation. You begin with recognizing that they got to where they are for reasons that I don't understand. But what they're doing isn't working. What they're doing is making things worse. I mean, this is quite frankly is the hardest question, and I can't give anyone a blueprint as to how it will work or how it should work. But the only way it can work is if we sit down and talk. A very dear friend of mine is Connie Rice, and she was part of a cohort of African American lawyers who regularly sued the police successfully for their violations of civil rights. And she told us the story of how the Canine Corps of LAPD literally trained their canines to go after African Americans. The dummies that they used were designed to look like African Americans. They were training their dogs to attack African Americans. She sued, she won the lawsuit. The judge was asking what kind of damages was she's looking for. And the police officers came to her and said, help us change. Work with us. And she began working with LAPD because there are enough people within the department, enough of these good cops in the department who were led in one direction and didn't say anything and now feel that they have a voice so that they from the inside can say, no, this is not acceptable. For those people who claim that 99% of these police departments are good, I don't believe it's 99%, but I believe that they are there. Give them the cover to do what's right. And we will move this needle.
Part of moving the needle, again, involves our being able to have open and honest conversations with one another. Another questioner wants to know, and this may be our last question, but I think it's a good note on which to end. What's your recommendation on how to have open and honest and respectful conversations about race, about what's happening right now on the streets, about all of the things that gave rise to the protests? What's your recommendation about how to have those conversations with people in the workforce? And the questioner specifically said the workforce because we know people start chatting at work and a conversation can quickly go sideways, and next thing you know, you've got an HR complaint. So how do we talk to one another in an open and honest way, while also recognizing that, you know, some people have, I think, a lower tolerance for digging into this issue, maybe because it's painful, maybe it brings up too much stuff, but some people may have a lower tolerance for digging deep than do others.
Again, quite frankly, I would look at the Me Too movement and see what they have been doing. The fact of the matter is, these are all difficult conversations. Why? Because you're changing a culture. And that culture needs to be changed. Quite frankly, it only takes one person to stand up and say, this is not acceptable. Because what I've discovered is that in any organization where there is a culture, there are a small group of people who want that culture to be in place, and a small group of people who are adamantly against that culture. And then there's this vast group in the middle that says, well, what's in it for me? And when you make it clear that this is not, when the leadership makes it clear that this is not acceptable, when the leadership makes it clear that complaints about this will be listened to, when the leadership stands up and says, I am not going to allow this culture to spread in my environment, then it's easy. The hard part is when the leadership is not saying that. And then it's up to you as an individual to be brave enough to say, no, this is not acceptable. I was one of those people. And what I found was, going back to that small story that I mentioned earlier, a lot of the people said, me too. I don't think this is acceptable either, but I thought it was what I had to do in order to be accepted. And now that I see you being brave enough to step up and say, this isn't acceptable, I empowered other people to say it as well. We don't realize how much power we have. We don't realize how much authority we have. We don't realize how much influence we each have. Jesus Christ was one person.
Ambassador, I think that's a wonderful note on which to end. I thank you for the conversation. Thank you for your service. Thank you for the work that you're doing now. And thank you for all reminding us that, for reminding all of us that we've come a long way. We have a much longer way to go, and we'll do it with the allies and others who are joined in the fight for justice. So thank you for this conversation, and thank you for giving us a lot to think about.
Thank you for having me.